Hello, welcome to this Azure Back to School 2024 session. This session is building a cloud-centric network with Azure Virtual WAN. By way of introductions, my name is Jake Walsh. I'm over on X at JakeWalsh90, and do feel free to check out my blog at jakewalsh.co.uk. So first and foremost, just a huge thanks to the organisers of Azure Back to School. Thank you to the sponsors. Please do check out all of the awesome sessions over at azurebackToschool.com. Loads of great community content, loads of learning, well worth checking out. So a bit of an agenda for this session. Over the next sort of half an hour, 40 minutes, we'll cover a few different items. Really, this is aimed at just sort of being an introduction to take you through Azure Virtual WAN, but we'll cover what Azure Virtual WAN is. We'll talk about use cases. We'll talk about core components. We'll talk about why you would use Azure Virtual WAN. What are those core benefits? We'll talk about security. We'll talk about expansion options. I'll cover sort of, where do we begin? How do we get started on this journey? We'll go into some options for building out a demo environment. I'll share some links to code, and I've just got some more resources to share as well. So what is Azure Virtual WAN? So Azure Virtual WAN is a networking service that brings various elements together in a single operational interface. Actually, one of the interesting things I find is when you talk about Azure Virtual WAN, it's not that well known. So it actually went GA back in 2018, September the 24th. 2018. Some of those key features are software-defined connectivity, centralized network management, and optimized sort of security, agility, thanks to using Microsoft's global network. We'll delve into some of these items throughout this presentation. So I said Azure Virtual WAN is a networking service that brings various aspects together as a single service. But what do I actually mean by that? Now, this is just an overview. It's not exhaustive. So these are kind of the most common things I see people using. So it actually replaces some of the hub and spoke topologies that you've probably seen. We use virtual WAN hubs, and we have VNet peerings. So those spokes are peered into those virtual WAN hub networks. It allows us to automate our routing and route tables, so we can have some of that routing automated, and that's particularly useful where we add new VNets, we build out new regions, and things like that. Allows us to centralize the management of VPNs and express routes, and makes that very straightforward, very centralized, very easy to manage and use. Gives us native firewalling options, so if we're using Azure Firewall as an example, we can integrate that with Virtual WAN. We can also look at third-party NVA options as well. Worth noting, and this is something I always say whenever you look at any service in Azure, as with most of the services in Microsoft Azure, they're always improving. So, most recently, 19th of June, that's certainly when I took the screenshot anyway, there were some new things coming to Virtual WAN. So I'd always recommend, as with any service, have a look at what's new, have a look at what the releases have been, just get an understanding of that, and it'll just give you an idea of where that roadmap is and what's been coming recently. So again, some of those services I talked about, Virtual WAN always improving some of the preview features. So there's a managed preview of route maps at the moment. There's a managed preview for the Aruba Edge Connect SD-WAN. Well worth looking at some of these just to understand what is coming down the line. So Virtual WAN, where is it available? Pretty much every region. If you actually go and look at the options, all of the regions support Virtual WAN. There's a wide range of locations. It's available in US government, Azure China also. Worth also thinking about availability zones. There are some considerations around using zones with Virtual WAN. I'd recommend reading some of the documentation if you're going to look into that. But you certainly shouldn't have any issues of deploying Virtual WAN in the regions that you need to. So let's get on to some of the use cases and the key aspects. So key aspect really, as I mentioned before, is bringing together core networking features. So that's things like branch connectivity, routing branch to branch traffic via Microsoft's network. That might be, geographically dispersed sites, for example, that you're using VPN connectivity for at the moment. It brings site-to-site VPN connectivity into Virtual WAN. We have remote user VPN connectivity via those point-to-site VPNs. We have that private connectivity via ExpressRoute. We also have intra-cloud connectivity, so connectivity for virtual networks. VPN ExpressRoute interconnectivity, routing configuration, route tables, custom routes, that sort of stuff. Azure Firewall and Firewall Manager integration, again, all managed via Azure Virtual WAN. And we have this transit and internal connectivity as well, hub-to-hub communication, spoke-to-hub communication, that sort of stuff. Um, I always, when I talk to customers about Virtual WAN, I always say it's a bit like a buffet. So, you might go and just take one or two things. You might go and, fill a plate full of stuff. There's lots of different services there. You may also go back later on and consume those services, a bit like you would a second helping, for example. So don't think of Virtual WAN as something where you have to take all of those services. It's like a buffet. You can pick and choose those various things that you need for your use case at that particular moment in time. There are two SKUs currently. So we have Basic. Basic only provides site-to-site VPNs. Standard provides the full complement of services for all of those use cases I've been talking about. Just a note, so you can upgrade from Basic to Standard, but you can't currently go back from Standard to Basic. So let's have a quick look at the core components. And in this, I'm just really going to run through these at a high level, just to give you some building blocks and an idea of what each of those, each of those components actually contains. Interestingly, I've said here, so 5 key components you'll use in all deployments that span more than one Azure region. If you're only deploying Virtual WAN in a single region, you're unlikely to be using a hub-to-hub connection. That only really comes into play when you're connecting those hubs across regions in Azure. So we'll start with Virtual WAN. So Virtual WAN itself is this virtual overlay of your Azure networking infrastructure. It's a collection of multiple resources, and it contains all the Virtual WAN components within your topology. And although you may have a Virtual WAN that spans multiple regions, this, similar to some other services, is shown as just an entity in a single region. It's the management point for it, really, with resources then deployed into the regions that you require. So a hub is a managed Microsoft virtual network, contains various service endpoints, and think of this really as replacing the hub in those hub and spoke models. So it's the core of that virtual WAN network. Typically one hub per region. You may have more if you're operating multiple VWANs, for example, multiple virtual WANs, sorry, I should say. And gateways, for things like VPN, ExpressRoute are deployed within those hubs. Firewalls, NVAs are also deployed within those hubs as well. And just one of the things to consider, again, this is just an overview, so I won't go into too much detail here, is think about the routing units. So it's important to consider, what traffic is that hub going to process, how many routing units will it need, and that's how Virtual WAN scales up those routing units to give you that throughput and traffic capability that you'll require. So let's just think about what's actually in the hub. We've talked about what it is. Let's have a look. So what can we actually deploy into that Virtual WAN hub? Well, it's things like a virtual network gateway, an ExpressRoute gateway, a gateway for point to site. We could deploy Azure Firewall or an NVA if we're using a third-party solution. We have route tables. We can also create a hub-to-hub connection. And you'll see in this diagram is through the Microsoft documentation, this example is using 2 Virtual WAN hubs, probably across 2 different regions. Well, that hub-to-hub connection is also deployed in that hub. And that allows items that are connected to each hub to talk to each other across that Virtual WAN topology. So I've just talked about the hub-to-hub connection, so preempted myself a little bit there, but those Virtual WAN hubs are automatically connected within a Virtual WAN topology. So hubs can communicate freely, and the routing is propagated by Virtual WAN. Inter-region connectivity, so for example, connecting region A to region B and vice versa, is established using those hubs. And those spokes that then connect to those hubs can communicate across that topology. It's worth considering. So there are actually some limitations, some things you need to consider, and that has been a subject of change perhaps over the last 12 months. So that routing, that connectivity can be controlled using a firewall or NVA. I've said here, you'll see I've scrubbed out the R on there. So there were some limitations around inter-region communication. You can now have that communication, and you can have this fully meshed topology. So if you're interested in just learning about some of those changes, I'd recommend having a read of some of that documentation I mentioned. But as it currently stands, you can have full communication, full mesh communication throughout that Virtual WAN topology. We talked as well, in some of the earlier slides about the idea of the hub and spoke. So this hub virtual network connection pretty much replaces that hub and spoke that you've probably seen before. So the Virtual WAN hub replaces the hub for obvious reasons, and the VNets become spokes off of that Virtual WAN hub. So a hub virtual network connection joins a spoke network to a Virtual WAN hub, and a single virtual network can be connected to a single Virtual WAN hub. Traffic is then enabled between the Virtual WAN hub and the spoke network, pretty much like the hub spoke topology we talked about. And then we'd use something like Azure Firewall or an NVA if you're using a third-party solution to actually control that traffic. Hub route tables are really important, and again, there's a link just shared there. I'd recommend having a look at that. So, routing something that's changed, certainly whilst I've been working with virtual WAN. So things like routing intent was something that came GA, I think, within just over a year ago. Might be slightly longer, but that's again worth checking out if you're using virtual WAN. So just on the route tables, each hub has its own default route table. You can edit that to put static routes in if you need. Static routes then take precedence over those dynamic routes. Those route tables are associated with a hub and its connected virtual networks. So that's something you need to bear in mind. It becomes a route table that applies to those virtual networks as well. Connections, so for example, things like a VPN, things like ExpressRoute or point to site, will also have a routing configuration that propagates to a route table, so to that route table in the hub. You can use labels as well to logically group those route tables. Again, something I would definitely recommend checking out. It's one of the key considerations when using virtual WAN. So I've talked kind of quite a bit about what about hub and spoke. Where does hub and spoke come into this? What are the similarities? That sort of stuff. So virtual WAN actually replaces existing hub spoke architecture with the spoke VNets. Those VNets that would have been spokes off of a hub peered into a virtual WAN hub. So it's quite a simple, straightforward replacement. The hubs are fully managed by virtual WAN, and you get this central management of all of the hubs in the topology. All of the spokes peer into a virtual WAN hub, and then connectivity into region, all of that sort of stuff is routed via that hub. And that hub would have your firewall, it would have your point of control, for example. So I've talked briefly just about, the kind of core elements. What about the core benefits? It's all well and good me talking about some of the different technical components, but what are the reasons we would actually use these components and deploy virtual WAN? So for me, probably the most important one is it's an integrated solution. So all of those core networking aspects in a single control resource, site to site, connectivity options, it's all easily accessed and managed, simplifies that administration for us as well. It's an automated solution, so we can connect virtual networks to the hubs easily. We have the routing dealt with for us. We can bring those additional services into virtual WAN with these. Again, I'm laboring the point here a little bit, but it's centralized, simplified, and automated. Very easy for us to do. Troubleshooting is another really important point. So that's sort of end-to-end visibility, rapid diagnosis of issues, simple troubleshooting, having everything in a single place, a single point of control really does help when there are issues that we need to look into. Centralized control, again, this kind of comes up. This is a bit of a recurring theme, but bringing all of those core networking aspects together under that single resource simply makes life easier. Removing the need to configure and manage multiple separate resources, bringing that all to a centralized point of control. Firewalling, again, integrated, so we can bring Azure Firewall in, we can use Azure Firewall Manager. We also have a wide range of MVA options, so we're not sort of losing anything by going down that virtual WAN route. We still have the options around Azure Firewall, we still have the firewall management, and we still have a plethora of NVA options that we can bring in if we need those third-party solutions. Rapid expansion, probably the last but by no means least sort of core benefit I'm just going to highlight here. So the expansion to other regions is very, very simple. And that additional routing, so the ability to expand to another region and have those route tables built out for us is very, very useful and really helps when you are perhaps, growing your Azure estate to different parts of the globe, other regions, that sort of stuff. So I'm just going to go into some of these and just give you some examples of some of these benefits. So I talked about an integrated solution. So this screenshot just from the portal. So all of the core networking aspects are in a single control resource. We don't go to different resources. We don't go to different items. Everything we could need is managed from the virtual WAN resource within the Azure portal. And you'll see here, we've got things like the hubs, we've got the VPN sites, user VPN configs, ExpressRoute, virtual network connections. Again, bringing all of that into one place for us to manage, monitor, deploy, control, etc., makes it very straightforward and really does simplify that administration. I talked about the automation as well. So actually having virtual WAN deployed, allows you to do things like connect virtual networks to the hubs very easily, bring additional services in with these. Again, it's centralized for you, it's simplified. And when you're actually using virtual WAN, you'll see here, for example, if I need to create an Azure firewall within that hub, I just click create, it walks me through the process, and that's deployed into my hub for me. It's very straightforward, very simple, and in many cases, it provides a level of automation that perhaps would have been, much more manual process to step through before. So troubleshooting, here I've just shown a screenshot of the metrics option, but there's loads of troubleshooting options within Azure Virtual WAN. We can start looking into data. We can take that data out perhaps to log analytics workspaces, to Azure Monitor, whatever we need. And it just gives us that visibility to allow us to do that troubleshooting of our core networking. So also centralized control. Again, this is just a screenshot of a virtual hub deployed in my lab environment. But again, you can see things in this. For example, I've got the option to create a VPN gateway, a user VPN gateway, express route gateway, firewall, and NVA. All of that is centralized and brought into one place where I can control, monitor, and manage. And before all that, deploy if I need to as well. So it just makes that really straightforward, really simple. Again, firewalling, another real core benefit. So we have integrations to Azure Firewall, we have Azure Firewall Manager, and we have those NVA options for third-party security providers as well. But again, that's all integrated into the virtual WAN control plane, all managed from that central point. And what's great about this is if we deploy, let's say, Azure Firewall, and we have a known good configuration, we have firewall policy, and we want to roll that out. As we deploy other hubs, we can easily enable Azure Firewall in those as well. So it makes it very straightforward and very simple for that expansion journey. Again, a nice little segue there, but rapid expansion. So creating new hubs, again, is done from the control plane I've been screenshotting and showing. Click on new hub, go through the process, provide an address space, very straightforward, very easy. And this really is interesting because if you have a deployment, let's say, for example, where you want to roll out to other regions, you need to get hubs deployed in places, perhaps around different parts of the globe. Actually clicking on new hub, running through that process, putting a very small amount of data in and getting it deployed, gives you that ability to expand to other regions very quickly with minimal effort. And what's also really interesting about that is that routing is built out for you automatically as well. So we can't talk about anything network related or deploying any service really in Azure without talking about security. This is, a bit of a hot topic for everybody, certainly in the IT world. You can't do anything without talking about security, and it has to be considered. It's an important consideration as part of any deployment, part of any infrastructure. The great news is there are numerous security aspects within Azure Virtual WAN. So I'm just going to kind of cover off 5 key areas really, just to give a bit of background, provide some context, and just show some options for security moving forward. So we've talked about Azure Firewall and the NVA options. I've talked about monitoring. There is also an option for packet capture. Administration is a point that I will come on to, but bringing that into a central place. And there's also a security baseline for Virtual WAN that's well worth consideration if you're looking to deploy this service. I'll just quick sip of my drink there. So talking about Azure Firewall and NVA options. So Azure Virtual WAN supports Azure Firewall, and NVA options are supported via those supported vendors. So there's a list of vendors available within the documentation. I'll provide some links to all of that later on. NVAs do have a deployment process that you'll need to run through. Again, straightforward, easy to deploy. Azure Firewall, however, is a very automated process. There's a very minimal few steps you'll need to go through and allows you to convert standard, so those are hubs without firewalls, to secure hubs that have Azure Firewall or another solution deployed in them. Again, you can see here some of the benefits around using Azure Firewall and those NVA options, things like, predefined, pre-tested selection of infrastructure choices, built-in availability, resiliency, no hassle provisioning, managed via Virtual WAN for you, simplified routing, integrated support. I won't read all of these, but you can see there's a whole plethora of options, and it's worth, if you are looking at a third-party option, just have a read of that link shared there, just to give you some context and a sort of wider reading around it. Again, just at the moment, there are a number of partners. So again, not an exhaustive list. Do check out the link shared there, but things like Barracuda, Cisco, VMware, Versa, Aruba. There's a whole range of different options that you could look at. And again, if you are looking to integrate with a third-party solution, do check out the documentation on Microsoft Learn. So just covering briefly some notes about the firewall and MVA options. So Azure Firewall provides that native firewall option, can be controlled and managed using Firewall Manager. We've talked about those security partner providers, so they can bring that security as a service to Virtual WAN. That's providers like Zscaler, Checkpoint, iBoss. One of the big changes, and I alluded to this earlier on, was that hub routing intent. So went GA back in May 2023, but that actually allowed some of the routing changes to be more automated. And I'd recommend just having a read of that just to understand some of those changes in Virtual WAN and what that more automated routing through routing intent and the ability to go cross region actually means when you do deploy Virtual WAN. So monitoring as well, another key aspect. So there's a wide range of options using Azure Monitor. As you know, with all Azure services, the ability to take some of that data to Log Analytics, to Azure Monitor, to third-party solutions. It's no different in Virtual WAN. There's also an insights dashboard, which is really useful for just giving you an overview of that topology. Similar to those kind of topology diagrams you see in architectures, in design documents, you can generate that automatically for Virtual WAN and just start seeing metrics on it and seeing the actual overview of your Virtual WAN environment. Again, I won't go through all of these because we'll be here for a very long time, but there's loads of metrics. Whatever sort of metric you need to monitor, whether it's point-to-site gateway bandwidth, whether it's BGP peer status, there's a whole range of metrics, and we can bring those into appropriate monitoring tools or look at them should we need to for troubleshooting purposes. Again, a few more metrics and a nice link there if you'd like to read some of these, but it's things like, looking at bits in per second, packets per second, CPU utilization of gateways, for example, diagnostic logs. There's a whole range of metrics. And if you're very much looking to build out customized dashboards, customized monitoring, you'd be very pleased to know that the same sort of metrics you would expect from a networking solution or environment are available in Azure Virtual WAN. Packet capture, again, another very important troubleshooting tool. So requires a virtual WAN hub, needs that site-to-site VPN gateway. So that's currently what it's supported for. It logs those captures to a storage account. So you'll need to have that set up. And it supports optional filters, things like TCP flags or max file size, but very handy for looking at that troubleshooting if you've got a problem with a site-to-site connection. Again, just some configuration of the packet capture, so we can set things like the max capture file size, packets to capture, sources, destinations, that sort of stuff. But again, if you're working in that networking space and you need that troubleshooting capability, this is really handy. I said I would talk about administration, and yes, this is fairly obvious, but I still think it's relevant to mention. So we have this centralized cloud networking topology with Azure Virtual WAN, and kind of the key aspect of this presentation really is showing how it centralizes a lot of that and creates this cloud-centric network. But actually having it centralized and using Entra ID for all of the administration means we can use things like PIM. We use MFA, for example. We don't need a jump box or a bastion to go onto perhaps a specific networking device or something like that. And using those PaaS offerings, again, it's simplified, it's straightforward, it's delivered as a platform service rather than blocks of infrastructure that we need to configure. It's also worth noting that the management via the Azure Resource Manager, the Azure Portal. When I actually deployed my demo environment for this, I used Terraform, and I'll share some links to that Terraform code as well. So there's a whole plethora of options, but again, the administration is very much simplified by going down this route with Virtual WAN. Also, I talked about a security baseline. So again, this is well worth a read. The Azure Security Baseline provides some Azure policy guidance, that sort of stuff, but it's well worth a read if you're looking at increasing the security, understanding those baselines, and just in general, want to focus more on the security for your deployment. Anyone deploying this in production, I would absolutely recommend that you read that security baseline just to understand, what it is, what it means, and how you can improve that security aspect of your environment. So we'll just talk briefly on expansion as well, because again, this is an important point, something that we need to consider really. So I've got a little diagram here. We're just going to start with a single virtual WAN hub. We've got an express route, we've got a VPN gateway for perhaps an IPsec tunnel or some point-to-site users. We've got a few spoke virtual networks paired into a virtual WAN hub, and all of the traffic is via a single firewall instance. So the question here really is, how would we expand this to other regions? What would that look like from an overview perspective? Well, the good news is It's very straightforward. So we'd go into the portal and we would click on New Hub, or we'd do it programmatically via, Bicep or Terraform, whatever it may be. When we add that new hub, as I've said, that regional expansion is very, very simple. The hubs are fully meshed by default, so we'd get that communication. So once we've clicked and deployed that new hub, we've gone through the process to build out Azure Firewall. We'd have an environment that looks like this. We'd have two hubs. So perhaps in my case here, we've got one in UK South, one in UK West. I have my firewalls deployed, managed centrally by Azure Firewall Manager. And we've got things like those spoke networks in region 1 and region 2. I've got my gateways deployed in region 1 and region 2. And those spoke networks would be able to communicate through those virtual WAN hubs, provided that the firewall rules allowed that. So you can see when we actually expand to other regions, we create this topology that allows that communication, but also through use of the firewall or an NVA option, provides us with that single centralized point of control throughout that topology. And it's largely the same if we went to 3 regions. We would have this fully meshed topology where all of the hubs could communicate. We could deploy firewall into all of the hubs as well if we need to. And all of those spokes, again, would be able to communicate through those hubs, provided that we allowed that in firewall rules. So hopefully you can just see as we start to expand, it certainly simplifies and makes that journey just that little bit easier. So just an overview of expansion. So regional expansion, yes, very straightforward, very easy. Firewalling, we can scale right up to the premium SKU with hub routing intent. So we get this cross-region and internet traffic. All of that can be forced via NVAs or Azure firewalls. Through Firewall Manager, we have things like centralized firewall rule sets, centralized management, again, support for ExpressRoute and VPN gateways, as we would expect, if we were deploying a standard hub spoke. We have this full mesh topology, so communication via the Microsoft Global Network. Spokes can also communicate, so spoke-to-spoke communication is enabled through that full mesh topology via firewalls with control if needed. A point on that, you can also block that via the firewall. If you don't want those spokes to communicate. We get automated route table management and provisioning. So when we expand out to other regions, those route tables and routes are built out for us. Single control of virtual networks via virtual WAN, so it becomes all part of this topology. And those routing units I talked about in the hub, we can scale up to 50 gig a second and 50,000 VMs per hub. So certainly plenty of room for expansion and lots of capacity. So just a note on where we begin. So my recommendation here would be get familiar with the basics and concepts using a lab. Don't go straight to production as with any service. I'll share a link to a Terraform environment I've built that can definitely help. You can get it deployed quickly and easily. Gives you something you can use just for testing and then destroy when you no longer need it. As with anything as well, upskilling and training, really important. So exams, the AZ700, the networking exam is really useful, as is the 305, the architect exam. Those sorts of skills will be very helpful if you're deploying a service like Azure Virtual WAN. Also have a plan. It's all well and good sort of doing a bit of labbing and testing and learning without much of a plan. But if you're looking to build this out and build out a production deployment, a plan around the sort of, the goals, the objectives, the requirements, that's really important to have that in place. When you do get to organizational deployment, start with a single hub, do some testing, expand from there. There's lots of guidance, and you'll see the next point down, consulting that guidance. There's Microsoft documentation for migrating from hub spoke through to a virtual WAN topology. Also worth noting, engage a partner. Look towards a Microsoft partner that can help you with that design, implementation, and ongoing support. Quick link here to my GitHub repository. So this virtual WAN demo will give you a fully functional virtual WAN environment. There's also some documentation that goes with it. If you're using Terraform, if you're familiar with Terraform, this will allow you to get up and running very quickly, very easily, and just then start really playing around and experimenting with virtual WAN. Also some useful links. Feel free to pause the video here if you need to grab any of these. But things like John Saville's videos, they're awesome for learning and getting more of a background. Global transit architecture, again, worth a read just to understand how all of that works in virtual WAN. I've got some guidance on deploying Azure Virtual WAN using Terraform. Terraform's something I use an awful lot, so written up how to deploy virtual WAN using that. A couple of demo environments, so demo environment and demo module. Also the exams I mentioned. well worth a look just to get your sort of exams and certification in place for Virtual WAN, and also some of the NVA options. Just a couple of links there to help with that. That's everything from me, but yeah, just thank you to the organisers of Azure Back to School 2024. Thank you to the sponsors. Please do check out all of the other awesome sessions, and hope to see you again soon. Thanks for watching.